Okay, hello everyone. I'm hoping that this is working. My screen is telling me that it's working. So, welcome to the Freelance Episode 2 Favourite Swords with Matt Easton. We are joined today, I am joined today by Nick, who you will remember from last month, and Matt, who you will hopefully be extremely familiar with. So, hi guys, how are you doing?
Hi, how are you both?
I'm all right, thanks. I'm a bit cold. I am filming from my shed, but I've got the heater on, so hopefully by the end of the hour we will be warmed up. Nick, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Oh, sorry, I was just checking that we'd started streaming properly, and we have. I am not cold, but you know.
No, you two are able to film from inside the comfort of your own homes, aren't you?
I'm actually the opposite end of the scale. I'm actually slightly too hot, which is why I'm in a t-shirt. For some reason, the radiator in my study is either on or it's off. The thermostat doesn't work on it. So when I close the door, I get boiling hot in here. I have to open a window.
Wow, so we've got all of the different options available here.
Yeah, I get something similar when I'm sat at the painting desk because that's where the radiator is directly under it, so you get sweaty knees.
Lovely. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah. Well, yeah. There we go. As British people, we do need to talk about how hot we are or what the weather's like. But today we've got a whole load of things to talk about. And Matt, this is just going to be the first of two parts for you. So after you've been chatting to us, you're going to go over to your channel and you're going to be live streaming there. What's going to be happening there?
Well, we don't know yet. So we're usually led by viewer questions. So Lucy's going to be joining me. She might possibly join at the end of this one, actually, but she's going to join me for mine. And I just realised I hadn't done a live stream for absolutely ages. I got into the habit of doing them quite often during lockdown. And then since lockdown, they've gradually become further and further apart, which is a shame. It's always something I like, I enjoy doing because it feels like more direct interaction with the viewers. But so we'll be led by their questions and just see where it goes. But I just thought, as I'm going to be live streaming with you, that kind of spurred me on to thinking, I need to do one as well on my channel. So I thought it'd be good.
An evening with Matt Easton.
Yeah,
it's like
an
audience with Matt Easton.
I hope my voice holds out.
Yeah, get some Lemsip going. So we have got a bunch of kind of segments that we're going to be going through tonight, and if in the chat you've got any questions or anything like that, please do drop them. Great to see people coming already. Some that I'm not even going to try to pronounce your names, but it's great to see you all. And we're going to move to the first of our segments tonight, which is Nick, projects, events, and research. So we like to do we're going to be doing kind of a bit of update. So every month, if you come to the freelance, you'll see what we're up to and what our guests are up to. So Matt, have you got any projects or events that you can share with us?
Oh my gosh, I've got too many things, so I don't want to bore the viewers. But yeah, I'm juggling so many things at the moment. I'm starting to kind of get to a stage where we're ready to open ticket sales for Skirmish, the HEMA event we run in Surrey in this year in June, a bit later than usually it's in May. And then Fight Camp as well, which is the main event in August, which I think you might be coming to.
I'm hoping to. Yeah. I've put in leave request, not with work, but with the family. So.
Cool. Yeah. No, I know how that works. Yeah. Leaving other people holding the children. It's always a diplomatic challenge. I'm working on several product development things with different companies at the moment. I'm going up to the Royal Armouries later in this month to do a load more measuring and photographing of the next batch of things I'm doing with Windlass. There's a couple of other companies I'm doing things with that should be quite exciting. I'll talk about another time. And as well as making videos and antique selling and that kind of stuff.
Cool. Loads of stuff going on.
Yeah.
Busy life. Nick, have you got any projects or events that you've been to that you're particularly excited about or coming up?
I have been under a pile of miniatures gaming projects, really. Nothing hugely reenactment or history related, though I did confirm my ticket to go to my first big festival lot at Empire at the end of April. So that is going to be a new experience, and I'm pretty excited about that.
Awesome. So have you got LARP weapons? Obviously you can use your reenactment kit, but...
Yes, yeah, the plan is use my reenactment kit because the group I'm going with, the Talbots, are late 15th century themed within the particular game. And yeah, I actually got LARP weapons way before, back before lockdown, and then that kind of put a down on me actually going and doing anything. So I have a LARP poleaxe that's basically a LARP version, exactly the same dimensions, like lengthwise and that kind of thing, as my reenactment poleaxe. So I'm pretty excited.
Great. Awesome. It's definitely on my bucket list to go and do some LARPing. I don't know if Matt, if you that.
Well, I'm smiling because, funnily enough, we've been talking about this exactly the same thing. It's funny how obviously we've got, although we do slightly different things to each other, there's so much overlap. And we've talked about getting a little group of us, because I mean I've got friends that go to Empire every year. In fact, there's people in my HEMA club who also do LARP or who also do reenactment. You know, there's so much common ground, and yeah, we've talked about having a kind of outing to go to Empire or one of these at some point. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, maybe we should all see if we can coordinate and.
I'd be up for that. Yeah.
Get a little gang going. So yeah, project wise for me, I have, if you see my video this week, I've been working on a Scabbard. This is one that I made back in 2019 and used it at Tewkesbury, Nick, and it broke on the first day. And then I was very kind of sad about it because I spent a lot of time on it. And then I watched one of your videos, Matt, with Matt who makes scabbards.
Yeah. And
the mind-boggling thing of having a linen wrap around the wooden core. So rather than start from scratch, I've started gluing it all back together and started piecing linen and leather. So,
what wood did you use for the core?
Because this is a long time ago now. I think it's poplar.
Oh, okay. So you did. So I know a number of people that have just used pine wood from the hardware store, and that doesn't go very well. They break really easily.
It wasn't that, which is what also made it a bit depressing. I think I possibly, because I wanted to get it the leather nice and molded round. I think I used too thin a leather as well. So I'm going to use a slightly thicker leather. And also making scabbards for reenactment blades is tough because they don't have the proper blade shape.
Yeah.
I'm suffering from a very similar problem in that I'm trying to make a scabbard for a LARP sword, which has an even like chunkier profile.
Yeah.
And there, and I'm like, start putting together a core for it. And like, if I put a core in this scabbard, it's going to be huge. Can
I make a suggestion? So depending on how much you care about how authentic something is underneath the surface, and let's face it, most shields are made of plywood underneath the surface.
That is true.
Why not use PVC? Why not just use plastic?
Well, it's possible. I may go uncored as well, and to be honest, just to reduce the bulk
for LARP. But even thinking about for reenactment, thinking about if you're going to fall off a horse on it, then why not just make it of plastic?
Yeah. So one of my first videos was about kind of having more than one sword, but having them for different reasons. because so many reenactors have got like 20 swords, and they're all
for the same thing.
They're all for the same thing, exactly. They're all different variations on the wide-edged, reenactment safe, blunt at the tip thing. And I think it's a really good idea to have your reenactment blade with, you make it work with whatever materials, and just have that as the one that you go on the battlefield with. And no one needs to see it except for on the battlefield. It can go in your tent for the rest of the weekend. And then have something that, maybe not a sharp, but something that's closer to original weight in an authentic scabbard with authentic strapping and all of that, to actually show the public.
And I agree with that. And also, there's, the weapons we use for HEMA drilling are usually lighter, or should we say slimmer edged thinner edged than most reenactment swords are. And, it doesn't necessarily need to be sharp, but it can be closer to, it could be what we call butter knife sharp, so essentially built like a sharp, but just not with the final edge applied. And it would give the public a far more accurate idea of what a sword's actually like, because we're constantly battling this misconception that medieval swords are great big chunky heavy things that you smash rocks with. Or
yeah I think most reenactors I think most members of the public tire of, not like physically tire, but emotionally tire of lifting all of the reenactors' weapons long before the reenactors tire of handing them over to say, like, and try this one, and try this one.
That's interesting.
I think you could probably do okay with one or two that are of interest, as a comparison.
And the other way to look at it is, don't necessarily look at the benefit to the public, but look at the benefit to the reenactor from the living history perspective. And, walking around with the most realistic thing in the most realistic way gives you a more accurate insight into living with that object than a typical reenactment sword through a metal ring hanging off your belt does. It's a completely different thing. Yeah. And from a simple point of view, at events where I've taken a few swords because I haven't been able to decide which one to wear, I often end up wearing a short falchion or messer, because it's a hell of a lot easier to wear around than a longer bladed sword. It's a lot more comfortable and easy. In fact, below a certain length, you almost don't even notice it's there anymore. But with a longer weapon, like if we go later into it, like a rapier or something, they're a bloody nuisance.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
That seems like a really good lead in.
Yeah.
It does. Yeah. So we have got a topic for this week, this month, I should say, and I've asked my Patreons to choose the topic. So once we have booked the guest, I ask my patrons of knight level, so we've got different levels, to choose which topic we're going to talk about, and then I share it with the guest, and we come up with what we're going to do. So what I've done is we're going to be talking about favourite swords. You probably know that because I think that's on the posts that I've been putting up. But we're talking about favourite swords. It's the title of the video, so of course you know that. You've clicked on it, okay? But what we're going to do is we've got Matt and Nick have both chosen 3 favourite swords that they're going to defend for 3 different contexts, because I knew that if we just did favourite sword, then that just wouldn't work out. We needed to narrow down what we're going to be using these swords for. Okay, so
and I just want to start and say that this question was really hard for me because my favourite sword is the one that's on the end of a 5-foot shaft, because I am mainly pole arms are my thing. So this was very, very different.
Yeah. And this is maybe favourite polearm could be a future episode that we can do.
So
with
funnily
Matt or with
enough,
someone else.
for me, I found the question very easy because I also like a polearm, but certainly in a battlefield context. So for me, well, I'll explain in a minute, but that completely dictated my choice of battlefield sword. Well, not completely, but like 80% dictated.
Yeah, very much informed it.
So before we do that, I'd just like to say thank you to the night level patrons. We've got Sirloin de Boeuf, we've got Robert, we've got Carrie, and Nightly Lady. So thank you guys for choosing this topic. That's a cool little button that reminds me, because I'm so bad at remembering names, even though I know them, and like some of them I chat to them every day. It's like as soon as you start recording a video and you have to remember a name, you're like, oh. So there we go. Anyway, let's move to the other view. Okay, so we've got 3 different options. We have got the battlefield sword, and here we've got 2 choices. I've not named them, but if you want to guess in the chat which person chose which sword, then please feel free. It seems that one of you has actually, unless you've chosen a specific sword in the photo, you've been extremely greedy and chosen a whole load. But anyway, right, who would like to own up to the one on the left?
Yeah, that's my choice.
Okay, so Matt, tell me about this sword and why you have chosen it.
So this sword is probably best described as the Westminster Abbey sword. However, if you look on the interwebs, or indeed many people's books and several TV documentaries, you'll see it described as Henry V's sword. Due to the work of Bob Woosnam Savage, formerly of the Royal Armouries, we're pretty much certain it's not Henry V's sword. It's almost certainly Henry VII's sword, which for Wars of the Roses people makes it more interesting. And because we have records from which swords were deposited as funeral-related things at Westminster Abbey. There was a sword associated with Henry V, but we don't know what became of it. Probably Oliver Cromwell took it and put it in his wardrobe. But we believe that due to the form of the sword, that this is almost certainly Henry VII, because we know there was a sword associated with Henry VII. So this is a beautiful, amazing, although it looks very simple, it's a wonderfully made arming sword. It's relatively short. From memory, it's got about a 26, 27-inch blade. But it's a hologram blade, so it's a very, for its proportions, although it's got a nice broad Oakshott Type 18 blade, so a good compromise cut and thrust blade, it's got very fine edges with a hollow ground, raised midrib, and it's got a sort of reinforced point. So this is wonderfully well suited to cut and thrust, but particularly I chose it as a battlefield sword. Number one, because it's short-ish, relatively short. Number two, because it's got a large crossguard, which I'm a fan of, because it's good for blocking things. And often a sword, by the time you pull a sword out, you'll be using it in defense rather than necessarily offense. Number three, because it's relatively short, it's good to wear at your side. And I would very much on a battlefield not go into a battle with a sword as a primary weapon. I would very much take a spear or a poleaxe or a glaive or something similar as a primary weapon. So shorter swords, easier to wear, get in the way less. Long swords, everybody loves a long sword, but long hilts get really tangled up when you're wearing armor and trying to use a poleaxe. You got a long blade and a long hilt. It's just a recipe for disaster, in my opinion. Although they were very popular, so who am I to say? But I just prefer this smaller sword. And finally, for fighting in armor, it's all about the shanking. It's all about the stabbing. So you've got a really good point with this sword. And because it's short, you can use your left hand for grabbing and grappling and wrestling, and use this like a big dagger to jam into people's armpits and faces. So I think it's a fantastic sword, and it's a wonderfully produced one. And something which not a lot of people know about this sword is the pommel is probably partially hollow. So it's a very big pommel, but because it's quite a light blade, they wanted a big pommel that wasn't very heavy. So it's part solid, part hollow, so that it's not too heavy.
Yeah, interesting, because that's obviously showing that the maker cares about not just about the weight of the sword, but also the dimensions. You know, with a broad blade like that, although it's a light blade, you need a heavy-looking pommel. Otherwise, it looks it looks wrong.
The other thing I'd say as well is that I think this is a sword very much catered to fighting on foot, and because on horseback you'd really be lacking in reach with this blade. Whether you're cutting or thrusting, 26 inches is super short for a cavalry sword. So I think this is really, and I can't ride. So
okay.
For me, that's and I have a replica by Mark Vickers of St George Armoury, who coincidentally also made my armour. But I just love it. It's one of my favourite. I've got more expensive replica medieval swords, but in the hand, it's just one of my favourites.
Great. Okay, right. Well, Nick, you've now got to defend your choice. Are you?
Well, I'm not really making a different choice to Matt here, I think, actually.
Okay.
I chose this because it shows kind of a broad selection of what I would categorise as like the most useful battlefield sword. Again, from the perspective of man in harness, fighting with the pole arm as a primary weapon. I think my choices are probably a little bit longer, but to be honest, like I agree that a shorter blade is better when you're wearing it at your side on the battlefield, partially because you get yourself tangled up in it, and partly because you get other people tangled up in it when it gets really close, and like tripping over your friends is also not a useful thing to do in either a reenactment or a historical battlefield context. And I think that it's interesting because all of the swords that are in this picture have that broadly similar, wide, tapering down to a very fine point, broad quillons, and a large pommel. I'm a bigger fan of the sort of fishtail or shaker pommels rather than a disc pommel, just for personal aesthetic. But yeah, I can't really argue with anything that Matt said. Why would I argue with Matt about swords? That seems like a terrible idea. But all of the reasons that Matt said are the reasons that I chose swords like this.
Okay, cool.
I can just say something actually on the wheel pommel. So, funnily enough, I used to also really dislike wheel pommels, and I still I dislike them on a two-handed sword. And I do also like the sort of fishtail pommels and scent stopper pommels and things like that. And I definitely prefer those on longswords. But something I found over the years is wheel pommels have grown on me, so to speak, for one-handed swords, because I find when the hand gets tired, and when you're wearing gauntlets as well, I find that the wheel pommel offers a really good safety measure against losing a grip on the sword. And so even if you might not like the look of them or necessarily even the feel of them in some cases, if we're thinking about life or death safety, what I don't want to be doing is ending up with no weapon in my hand. And so I do think wheel pommels, one of their biggest virtues is keeping them in your hand.
Oh, I wouldn't disagree with that. And I actually, as you were saying that, I think that partially my experience with wheel pommels is coloured through a reenactment lens of having kind of generic swords with generic hilts and pommels, where if the hilt's a bit short for your hand when it's in gauntlets, then that wheel pommel really gets in the way, where the fishtail or the scent stopper pommel doesn't in the same way. And that kind of thing. But certainly, I mean, admittedly, my personal arming sword that I wear on the battlefield when I'm doing kind of mid-status stuff has a wheel pommel on it, and I don't find it problematic. Just, aesthetics. It's all about showing off.
Okay, so it's going to be a tough one here, because you're basically agreeing with each other, and I've got to agree. Like when I had my my reenactment sword made, I specifically asked for a shorter blade. And it's worth pointing out as well, if you're going to carry a sword, then it's actually not just the blade length, but the length that it is in the scabbard as well. Because the scabbard will increase the blade length probably at least an inch. And so, you know, when you start getting to longer swords, that can really make them even longer. We have had someone in the chat has said, Beachmaster has said that the audio is getting a bit painful. I think there is a buzz. We did have one before from Matt's microphone.
Is that better?
Is that a bit better? Chat, let us know if that is a bit better. Hopefully that is.
Matt hold his mic like a TV presenter.
Yeah. I mean, I think the wheel pommel is one. It was around for so long, right? There's got to be a reason for it to be around for so long, and we see it a lot more. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, Matt, but we see it a lot more on the single-handed short swords than on the longer hand and a half ones. So I think
there's not a simple answer to that question. Thanks for letting us know that the buzzing's quieter. So essentially my microphone was too near to the monitor, so I've moved it anyway. So that's good to know for my live stream as well. So wheel pommels, the first longswords that were around did have wheel pommels, because wheel pommels were the standard pommels at that time. But what's interesting is shall we call them more elongated pommels or whatever, do seem to perhaps have been influenced by the use of two hands on a sword hilt. They appear around the same time as longswords got popular, which is essentially the 1360s and 1370s. So the first examples I can think of like scent stopper pommels, for example, or kind of like plum-shaped pommels, is around this time, and that's exactly the same time that sword hilts get longer to be gripped by two hands, if not all the time, then some of the time. So I think there's a correlation there, whereas wheel pommels seem to have stayed popular on single-handers all the way through into the 16th century, probably for reasons of retention.
And as far as the length and on a horse is concerned, although it's context specific, and we're actually talking about battlefield here, so it's not the same thing, but in René's treatise on the tournament, he talks about having a sword that's no longer than your arm. And that's for a mounted melee. So, you know, it's not just, that's things to think about,
though, isn't it? That's mounted versus mounted. So I think certainly if we fast forward to the 19th century, then the main reason for example, heavy cavalry had longer swords than light cavalry, and the main reason was because they had taller horses, so they still needed to be able to reach infantry. So if you've got a taller horse, you need a longer sword, otherwise you can't hit the guy who's standing on the ground. So yeah,
absolutely. Reaper with no name also mentions about how if it's longer, then it takes longer to draw. If you're in a life or death situation, you know, that extra half a second could
certainly in, I mean, again, reenactment combat, not life or death, but certainly my first go-to when somebody has closed, when I'm using the polearm and I can't bring the polearm into play, is to go for a dagger, not for a sword.
The funny thing is, so we've done quite a lot of, obviously this is unarmored, and unarmored spears are monstrously formidable, because, you know, just one thrust from a spear in your torso, or even your thigh or your groin, and obviously your face, and that's kind of a fight finisher. In armor, that's a different situation, because obviously it won't stop you necessarily, but therefore the spearman who can keep range and stop the swordsman closing down, what we actually found is a person with just a dagger pretty much is on exactly the same footing as someone with a sword. And if anything, some people, if they're fairly quick, actually have an advantage with a dagger compared to a sword, because they can move the dagger around quicker, and of course a spear can be grabbed, can be pushed, it's not got a blade along its shaft, and so a dagger that can sort of block and enable you to charge in and get to this distance, where the spearmen can, I won't say they can't do anything, but there's not, you know, they're at a disadvantage.
You limit their options.
Yeah, it's a funny thing, and a lot of people think, oh, I'll use a longsword against the spear, and actually longsword struggles against spear in an unarmed context. whereas dagger actually does surprisingly well.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think we can all be in agreement then. On the battlefield, you don't want a sword that's too long, especially if it's not your primary weapon. We can talk about Landsknecks and stuff like that some other time, and we'll definitely talk to Matt about the great sword in the Royal Armouries collection at some point as well, because that is probably a different topic entirely. But,
I think we've got Augusto who's joined the chat. I think that's Magister Armorum is Augusto.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, he was with us last time. He's joined us again now. A few friendly faces in the chat from previous live streams. So good to see everyone. If you do have any questions, do drop them in the chat. We're trying to move quite quickly, and then hopefully we'll get time for questions at the end as well, because like we said at the beginning, Matt's got a second live stream later this evening and on his channel. So we're going to, once we've finished this at 9 o'clock, you can head over there to carry on chatting with Matt. So I'm going to move on then. So battlefield, we've done that. What about everyday carry? So we've got two swords here. We've got... They're different ones this time, which is nice. I'm going to ask Nick, can you explain your choice first of all, and then we'll go to Matt.
I can certainly give it a go. So I went with the weapon on the left, which is kind of typically known as a messer, and this particular example is Todd's Workshop example, and I went for this for similar reasons that we talked about with the sidearm and the battlefield carry. Because it's a shorter weapon, it's easier to carry, it doesn't get in the way of things. But specifically, I went for a messer in this situation because, this is where Matt will correct me with the regioning, but there are many cities in Europe that ban the carrying of swords within the city limits, but they do not ban knives. And my understanding is that a messer gets around that by being made by a knife maker with the characteristics that make it a knife, not a sword. So it allows you to carry what is essentially a sword in a situation where you really shouldn't. And that's pretty much the main reason I went for this over anything else. It fits a lot of the other characteristics that I like about a weapon. It's got a short blade. It's useful in up-close situations, which if you're wandering around, you're going to probably end up... That's the kind of combat you're going to end up in if you're going to have to draw your weapon. That's where I'm at.
And if you're ambushed on the street, it's unlikely the thugs are wearing too much armour. So cutting rather than thrusting might be what you want to do.
Certainly, this is a heavy cutting weapon, not a finesse thrusting weapon.
And so moving over to Matt, who seems to have chosen a finesse thrusting weapon. Do you want to explain your thoughts?
Well, so what I chose was an early side sword, and assuming that we were talking about a 15th century, late 15th century context here. So contrary to I think what a lot of people's preconceptions are, side swords first appear in Italy actually surprisingly early. We see them with finger rings and knuckle bows as early as the 1450s and 60s. And in fact, this example pictured is from the Royal Armouries, and actually it's a very early example, dates to about 1410. This is an Agincourt period sword with a finger ring on it. Now, what's interesting about this sword is it's really light. It's about 800 grams, if I remember correctly, which is about the same as an infantry officer's sabre of the 19th century. And it's similar proportions. It's about a 34-inch blade. It's a cut and thrust blade. I've got the measurements for it, and although it starts off fairly thick, about 8 millimeters at the base, it has a lot of distal taper. So it's an incredibly quick and responsive sword. And the reason I chose it for my EDC, assuming that I lived in a place where I could wear a sword legally, and in London you could wear a sword if you were traveling outside the city, or if you were coming in or going out, this kind of thing, is because, and also we know people carried them illegally as well, because it's mentioned people breaking the laws. That's why we know about the laws, because people get breaking the laws. If I was going around a city at night getting into mischief, I'd want a sword that was quick, had a good reach advantage, and was a good cutter and thruster. And in many ways, I see this as the precursor to the rapier. And I very much consider the rapier of the 16th and 17th centuries as the ultimate civilian, essentially self-defense sword, because you've got the best reach advantage, you've got good hand protection, it's very quick, and so essentially I chose what was the 15th century equivalent of a rapier, but also I cheated a bit because I said I would carry this and a buckler. And sword and buckler was absolutely the standard armament in England for most of this period, in France and also in Italy as well. And in fact, we've got extensive treatises on sword and buckler fencing, and it was the precursor to rapier and dagger was sword and buckler. And it maintained, sword and buckler was still the most popular self-defense system, should we say, in England and London specifically, all the way up until about 1560, 1570, and then we know there was a switch over to rapier and dagger, because we read accounts of this time of people having fights between sword and buckler and rapier and dagger, and eventually a combination of fashion and maybe people seeing the results, people switched over predominantly to rapier and dagger from about 1580 onwards.
Yeah, so the in a lot of the guards, the buckler is being used to defend the sword hand, isn't it?
Yes and no. So, there's two main sword and buckler systems we know a lot about. One is the so-called Tower Effect book, as some people call it, or 133, I33. And in that's the case, that the buckler stays with the sword hand most of the time. But I'm actually more of a fan of the Italian Bolognese stuff, and in that, it's actually far easier to learn because the buckler basically stays out extended the whole time, and you fight around the buckler arm.
So it is defending the sword hand. It's just by blocking
in a different way,
further out.
Yeah. You use it more like a shield, actually.
Yeah. Guys, I am going to. It's a difficult one to choose, to be honest, because I have loved the sword ring, the finger ring on the sword, ever since I saw it on one of the ring race blades in Lord of the Rings. I was like, that is an incredible idea. That's great. So much of my history knowledge, early history knowledge, came from Lord of the Rings, and I'm not a massive fan of messes, and I think it's possibly just because they're used a lot in reenactment, and I don't know how much they were used in England. They're used a lot by English reenactors, and I don't know. I think
they were used a lot in England. There's a whole category of them known as the so-called Wakefield hangers. They were extremely popular in England. Yeah,
but they weren't called messes, were they? They were. That's not an English term that they were used by. So, it may well be my own prejudices and love for cool ring wraith equipment, but I'm going to go with Matt on this one, and I'm going to go with the sword. Sword with the fingering. It's very nice. And Augusto has made a point. Wouldn't walking around with a buckler show that you're up to no good? I think
yes.
It would.
But you know, also that's useful. If you want people to be scared of you, then maybe it's a good thing to look like you're up to no good.
But culturally, if we look at America, for example, where open carry is allowed, things like that become a fashion item, don't they?
Yeah. And we know that happened with rapiers. I mean, there's records. Yeah. They literally there's people complaining in the 16th century about people walking around wearing swords and not having a clue how to fence.
Yeah. Yeah. There's I remember going to back in, or it might even have been 2012 for the Olympics, or it would have been the London Olympics. The Wallace collection had a rapier and fencing exhibition, and when you get to the 16th century, they actually match their swords to their clothes. So you would have a sword with matching sword belt and scabbard that also matches the doublet and breeches. So it really became a fashion item. Okay, so it's close, but I'm going to go with the stabbing sword rather than the cutting.
Can I just address? Augusto made a point there, and he was saying how it might denote you're up to no good, and that there were laws regulating against them, and that's completely true. In England and France, not so much in Italy. In Italy, it was tolerated for people to walk around with swords. Hence, that's where a lot of the dueling culture arose. And in Germany, it was different from city to city or state to state. However, the messer, I believe, wearing of a messer in London would have been just as prohibited as wearing a sword and buckler. I think they were treated the same. And you were allowed to wear a dagger. So they allowed you to wear a dagger, but nothing as big as a... And this is possibly one reason why basillards got very big in the 14th century, to try and get around this, because it looked more like a dagger. But I don't think that hangers and messers in Britain were regarded as daggers. I think they just went, no, that's a sword, mate.
And it's possible someone like tried it to get it round the loophole.
Yeah. Oh, and the other thing is, if you're a knight, you can wear whatever you like. And it was, it's so specified. If you are knighted, then if you have Sir before your name, then they even had to go as far as to say you could have one servant to carry one sword for you, which means that some knights have gone, so the laws say that I can carry swords around, and it doesn't say how many servants, so they basically had a small army following them around, all carrying swords. So they even had to kind of clamp down on the knights and say, no, you can have one sword and one
You only need one. Well, I've allowed you to have 3 swords today, so I feel very generous compared to the medieval towns. So this is the last one. So for home defense or dungeon raid. So this is kind of thinking about in the close confines of like hallways and things like that. What is the weapon that you would most like? And Nick started the last one. I think Matt's got his ready. Having visited Matt's house before to do some filming, he's probably got one of these in every room. He's got hundreds of swords. Tell you what, let's go with Nick again, because it's been a while since Nick's spoken. Nick, you chose the swords on the right.
Yeah, I went with a long sword here. If only because in terms of like the narrow, like close confines, hallways, I wanted something that had like a multitude of uses, and I couldn't pick a poleaxe, so I went with a half-sworded, a long sword being used in a half-sword situation, or using the back end as well as bringing the point into play, is basically like a poleaxe but a bit shorter when you want to get up close and deal with things like that. And yeah, that's pretty much where I went here. Just wanted to try and get as much utility out of the single weapon that you're carrying as possible without the advantage of a large polearm.
And obviously this can do both, but these ones, the shaping on the blade, I'm not very good at Oakshott typology or anything like that, but the shapings on the blade is very very thrust oriented, rather than, obviously it can do both, but they're long and thin with a narrow point for keeping someone at arm's length, I should think. Matt, you're there cradling your choice. What have you chosen? And why?
So I chose one of the Wakefield hangers there that I was just banging on about a minute ago. So this is a typically English mid 15th all the way through to the 16th century sidearm, and this is, we believe, a type of sword that was very often carried by billmen, gunners, archers, people like this. So common soldiers. So it's a sidearm. And in many ways, this is the precursor to the later saber and hanger that we see all the way through. I mean, policemen carried a sword pretty much like this in the 19th century, you know. So an incredibly popular and long-lasting fundamental type of design, even if this specific design is very particularly English and of the 15th century. In function, it's not very different to short, you know, cutlasses and hangers that we used for hundreds of years after this. The reason I specifically chose this is because you labeled this home defense and dungeon raiding. So I was thinking confined spaces. So in much the same reason as someone would choose a cutlass to fight on board a ship, or the reason that police had short swords, probably for use inside buildings and prisons. Prison guards had them as well. So, you know, confined space, I think, and also this particular style has added hand protection. So this is one of the best degrees of hand protection that you can get in the 15th century. I mean, this particular one I'm holding is actually it's one of the earlier prototypes when we still had the sidebar on, but there is one in the Royal Armouries like this which has a sidebar. So you've got a knuckle bow, you've got a sidebar, therefore you've also got the nargle element here. You've got a large rear quillon. So by 15th century standards, you've got a huge amount of hand protection for a hand that doesn't have a gauntlet on it. So the reason I didn't choose this for the battlefield is because for the battlefield, I was assuming I'm in full harness, so I don't need anything more than a crossguard. For this, I'm thinking home defense. I'm not going to be ready. I need to get it out quickly. It needs to be easy to get to and store and this kind of stuff. However, I don't think the longsword's a bad choice at all. And certainly the longsword's got, I mean, like you said, half swording with it and using it in a corridor or something like that gives you a big reach advantage. And they've each got different strengths and weaknesses, I guess. The other thing I'd say as well, home defense. I think we always think of home defense as being inside the home, but we know a few accounts from the medieval period of where people were doing home defense, but they went outside their house to defend their house. Bearing in mind that most people didn't have locks on their doors; they just had a large dog. You know, if you've gone outside your house to defend your home, then a two-handed sword is a really good idea. And in fact, there was I think it was, I can't remember which fencing master it was, but he was called out by someone in the early 16th or late 16th century. And so he went, okay, I'll have some of that. And he went outside with a massive two-handed sword because he was known as a rapier master, but he obviously for home defense chose the biggest sword on his wall.
Just try and win before a strike has even been put in. I mean, it's intimidation.
It's one of the few swords that can take on a rapier and win. Is a massive Zweihander.
Yeah, I think this is such a tough one. I was thinking that a messer would be a problem because you'd be having issues with striking the walls and things like this. The particular one that you've chosen has got enough of a point that it's also a problem in the thrust as well, right? There are some falchions that are not as good in the thrust. I don't know. I'm going to go with the longsword personally, but I see both of your points. So if anyone in the chat wants to leave what they would choose out of these two, please feel free. I think, you know, it's a photo finish for me, and it's probably just my own personal preferences coming out again. You've both made really good points. Lovely. Well, there we go. That is 3 sword choices. I think we probably haven't persuaded anyone. I think we've just had a nice time talking about swords for a long while. I know, Matt, you're going to have to go in a little while, but I know that we have had some questions in the chat, and it would be great to just have some of them. Have you got a few minutes to deal with some chat questions?
Yeah, sure. I've got 5 minutes
before we go.
I have to dash over to.
Great.
I've collected a list. I don't know if we'll get everyone's. I'm going to try this throwing the question on the screen thing so that we can all see it. And I'll go from the earliest one that we got asked, and we'll see how many we get through. So
great, and we can always keep hold of them for a future Q&A video, hopefully.
So first one up on the screen, and this was asked in the context of things seen in Flemish art and about struggling to find examples of high status daggers. So continental weapons in Britain. Thoughts, Matt?
Yeah. So. Yes. So, well, we know that continental weapons were very common in Britain. However, that's a complicated factor because if we look at text records, you can sometimes, it's the same thing with armor. You can sometimes see records of armor being imported from Italy or being imported from Flanders or wherever. But we don't know what style it was in. And, you know, Toby Catwell wrestles with this factor in his books, because just because armor comes from Italy doesn't mean it's Italian style armor. It could be built alla tedesca or alla francese or this kind of international style, as he ends up calling it. So we can look at an armor on an effigy and it can look English, but it could be made in Flanders, it could be made in Italy, we don't know. So that's one side of it. So we know from the text records lots of weapons. We know bills were imported from Italy, for example. So the Italians were importing longbow staves and bills and sallets as well in large numbers during the Wars of the Roses. In terms of the styles of them, yes, we do see certain types of sword. For example, the Castillon swords, we can't tell whether they're French or English because that style of sword was used in both countries during the end of the 100 Years' War. But there are, like we saw with the Wakefield hanger, and we know there are certain types of sword and certain types of rondel dagger which are specifically, or we believe, are specifically English in style. But again, we see, if we go to the continent and we look at the Duke of Burgundy's records, we see him importing English gauntlets. We don't know what that means, but clearly to the Duke of Burgundy, he knew what English gauntlets were. Yeah. Maybe something to do with the wrist articulation or the way the fingers were. We just don't know.
And we've lost so much of our art, haven't we, in England, through...
Well, and a lot of our art was made in Flanders, so that's the problem. So you take something like the Beach and Pageant manuscript, it's written in English, and it's commissioned for English people, and it's held in England, but we know that the artist was Flemish.
But because of that, it's hard to say what is the English style and what is the Burgundian style unless it's clearly labelled or clearly marked, right? Because through the Reformation and the Civil War, we've lost an awful lot of art from churches and from castles that were destroyed.
What we have got absolutely a buttload of course, is effigies, and that's why Toby managed to make 3 books basically out of effigies. And conversely, the problem they have in France is they don't have many effigies because of the French Revolution, because the revolutionaries went around smashing all the effigies. I mean, I've seen castles in churches in France where everything has been defaced up to a certain level, which apparently was the length of their ladders. And once they got as high as they could reach with their common ladders, they just gave up at that point. So you've got all of the sculpture above that and nothing below. So they destroyed all the effigies because they could get them. So the problem is we look at English effigies and we go, this must be English in style, but then we don't have an awful lot of French effigies to compare with. So for all we know, we might find the same style armour on French effigies as well, because we know there was obviously a lot of interaction at that point.
Yeah. Let's move on to the next question, because again we can talk for a very long time. But I know Matt.
This one's directly for Matt. Specifically asking Matt, favourite straight bladed cut and thruster.
I can't answer that question. I've got a different favourite for every period. So if I was in the 19th century, I'd have a particular type of sabre. If I was in the 15th century, I'd have a particular type of arming sword. If I was in the 16th century, I'd have a particular type of side sword, like the Munich town guard sword, as it's commonly known. Things like that. So I've got many favourite ones that I would, whichever time, like Bill and Ted adventure time I'd plonked in, I'd have a favourite one for that time.
Very good. Okay, let's move on. This one is from Ivan Miletic. Question concerning armour outside of England, Italy or Germany. Do you know any research concerning more in-depth on variations in France or Spain, or melting pots like Hungary, German and Italian influences? I think this is an ongoing thing, isn't it? We're at quite an exciting point where there's a lot of people who are doing the research, and they're at different points in how able they are to publish it. But heading over to some Facebook groups like the 15th Century European Armour Facebook group and things like that, there's a lot of research going on, and you'll find some people who are already neck deep in their PhDs or whatever, and looking into it. So I'd recommend doing that. Anything to add, guys, on that one?
No, it's a massive, massive question, and I'm looking forward to seeing people's further research in future decades.
Some future videos for that as well.
Yeah,
probably. Yeah.
All right. Quick answer, which I think the last part is the most important one of this question. Just, if you could ride any animal as a knight, which dinosaur would you ride? Zach, go.
It would be the Carnotaurus, which is the best dinosaur. It doesn't get enough press. It's basically a T-Rex, but with shorter arms and with horns on its head. So it's like if
it's even shorter arms than a T-Rex.
Even shorter arms than a T-Rex.
You
it's
can't
like
wield a sword with little stubby arms.
No, I'm not. I'm riding the dinosaur. I think that's the question, right?
Yeah. Dinosaur to have the extra sword, right?
No, the dinosaur. The dinosaur's arms don't want to get in the way of the sword, so the dinosaur can. Yeah. Yeah, Matt. What's your answer?
So I was initially going to say Allosaurus, which is my favourite raptor, but actually that would make a rubbish steed. I would actually choose a Triceratops because it's got an inbuilt shield, so you can you can leave off the leg armour, nice and comfy, easier to go to the toilet, and as well as your one lance, you've got 3 more lances on the front of it.
Good. Nick, what about you?
Matt is just like taking my ideas out of my mouth all evening. No, my first thought was Triceratops again. You know, it's like having all of the parts of the lance, but directly in front of you, so you can do other stuff. But in the absence of being able to choose a Triceratops, I would pick like something fast, like a medium-sized raptor, so you can get around quickly and the fast cavalry strikes rather than the heavy.
You can have my Allosaurus then.
Oh, yeah, thanks.
I could tell that all the time that Matt was speaking during the sword discussion, Nick was thinking about this question.
I should also mention that Lucy, who's standing just outside the door, is also laughing a lot at this. So.
Okay, well...
The answer is Ankylosaurus.
Lucy says Ankylosaurus.
Oh, okay.
Do you want to come and join us, Lucy? You've got opinions. Lucy, why is Ankylosaurus the correct answer?
Because it's a tank with a mace on the end of it. So it's effective in all manners.
So it can swing around with that mace from the back. Yeah, that's pretty cunning.
And stamp on people.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I
guess the
over.
It looks a bit painful to sit on to me, but
yeah, just a wide stance, or maybe just stand up on top of it rather than. I know.
We do have some more questions, but we don't have. We will collect those together for.
We're out of time.
Well, why don't we do this again sometime on this channel? But for now, if people want to bring any of these questions over to my channel, they're more than welcome to.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. It's great to chat, and we'll definitely get you on again, and we'll have some more questions and another topic.
Awesome.
Thank you, Matt. Cheers.
See you soon, guys.
Bye bye.